Naim, and we all heard him do 2 musical offerings and a beautiful voice. And he's going to speak his voice for Earth Justice. And you today, for this session, you said definitely we should hold questions until you're done.
Yes, please. Okay. So, before I start, I just want to apologize on behalf of 2 other people who I thought I would present with. They had some vehicular difficulty. Couldn't make it. So, originally this was supposed to be a panel on local organizing in Detroit. And I modified, since it's not a panel discussion, to this presentation, which I think is prudent or fruitful to talk about as it pertains to climate change, and we can just kind of take a step back and rather than frame what we're primarily talking about as climate justice, just justice in general, since there's not really a need to fragment something that isn't subjective or relative. Like, it's either a just system or it's not. Racial, sex, political, class, whatever. And do that through the lens of Detroit, which I think is just a perfect case study, not to simplify a city to a case study, but all the dynamics that have made Detroit what it is today are really the reflection of injustice. It's about maybe 30 to 40 minutes if I just get through the slides, so that should leave a good bit of time to talk after. I do encourage you, if you were triggered or curious about anything, to just make a mental note, and I would be more than happy to discuss it with you more. And I think as we move through it, everything else will take care of itself. So, my name is Naim, and this is just a graphic or a bunch of images that kind of tell you a little bit about me. In Detroit, I work primarily for Voices for Earth Justice, a small interfaith nonprofit dedicated to fostering interpersonal relationships and reconnecting people with nature. The Detroit Black Community Food Security Network, which is a predominantly Black organization founded to address food security in the city. The Great Lakes Bioneers, which is a chapter or a group of the National Bioneers, which has its conference every October in San Marin, which takes pioneers from biological engineers, so people who try to use ecology and biological principles to inform other realms of our lives and how we live. I'm a gardener, so the garden in the middle. Can everyone see relatively clearly?
Yep.
Okay, cool. And that's a picture of me on the University of Michigan's website. Super lucky for just to be that random person. You know how they take pictures week to week. And I had been giving a presentation on some of my master's thesis work, which looked at how food systems, particularly in Ann Arbor, interact as it pertains to economic incentives, management techniques, and just garden management styles that people use and how it affects biodiversity, how that biodiversity can be used to increase the produce and production, and how the policies of the organizations that run community gardens in Ann Arbor affect the community garden's effectiveness. Okay. And I went to Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia. It's where Martin Luther King went to school. It's an all-male, predominantly or historically Black school. So, quick intro. I'm gonna let you guys speak, change my mind. If you could say your name and one thing you know about Detroit. We can use, I don't need to know. No talking piece.
So I'll start the circle.
Mm-hmm.
I'm Merle, and one thing I know about Detroit is that there's a lot of people working to bring it back to a healthy, strong city again.
Thank you.
I'm Sherry, and what I know about Detroit is that the state government is stealing the teachers. They've taken like 10% of their compensation and withheld it from them, and they're not getting it.
I'm John, and I don't know, the first thing that popped to mind was Motor City.
I'm Jonna, and I know that my brother lives there.
I'm Jules and I work in affordable housing and I'm on boards of a couple of housing nonprofits in Detroit. I'm in and out of all.
I'm Howard, and I was really impressed at the 2010 U.S. Social Forum and since then
Oh, yeah.
with the resistance of people in Detroit to things like emergency management and the destruction of their city. So they've been partially successful at fighting it.
I'm Mike, and I'm pretty sure the Renaissance Center is a massive building with single pane ceiling to floor windows.
Wow, is that true?
Yes, I've been in the rooms.
Hi, I'm Nelson. I saw Bob Dylan switch from acoustic to electric in 1965,
Oh, wow.
and which dates me. And I love the Diego Rivera mural in the Art Institute. A lot of other things too, but those.
My name's Gary, and I know that at least 1 in 7 black men in Detroit can't vote because of their contact with the criminal justice system.
My name is Patrick, and I have a few friends from there.
I'm Tom, and I know that there's a lot fewer people living in Detroit than there used to be, and I've heard it's one of the most segregated areas in the country.
I'm Mara, and I know that there's a tremendous struggle going on for, I'm going to use the word justice, for water justice and water availability.
I'm Avi, and I'm pretty sure Detroit is the home of Motown and probably a lot of other incredible music.
Frank, and years ago I saw a documentary about the water situation in Detroit, how the manipulation.
So, Mia,
Mira here.
we were just doing your name and something you know about Detroit.
My name is Mira, off the wall. Because I used to be shy, painfully shy, and I'm not anymore. And I grew up on the left in Detroit, and on the left side of Detroit, just within West Grand Boulevard between Michigan and Warren Avenue, just 1 block inside, in a wonderfully diverse neighborhood that was changing from middle class, and I like to say I'm from the lower class. And, because I'm not as poor as some people from there, and whenever I go into a place that's filled with white people, there's something missing. Always feels that way. And I'm in the most diverse neighborhood in Cincinnati, and unfortunately, we're trying to stop the gentrifying. Thank you for listening.
Okay. Could I see a show of hands if you've been to Detroit? Alright, pretty much everybody. Excellent. So, I modified this presentation, which I first did for a group of undergraduate students at the University of Michigan who were doing a summer internship there, just to give them like a foundation of why a lot of the things that they would see in the city are the way they are. I didn't explain how I ended up there. I've only lived there for 2 years now. I got my master's at U of M, and I moved there after and became essentially a garden designer. That's my primary profession, but through garden designing have gotten involved in a lot of other activism and social justice work. So I want to try to tie in climate and justice issues based on the history of Detroit. After the semicolon, it says single story, so essentially what I'm giving you all is a narrative of Detroit as I understand it. I do not claim to know or understand Detroit's history in its entirety, nor am I capable of conveying all of that in this one sitting, if I did. And then I'll end with organizing efforts. So if there's anything that I missed, please save that for the end. And if there's any questions, I look forward to the dialogue when we're done. Okay. A huge part of work and life in Detroit kind of unfortunately revolves around racism because it's a predominantly black city that was not supposed to be that way. And this is a really incredible book that I read my first couple months there, The Origins of the Urban Crisis. And it's just a really thoroughly investigated historical document of a 20th century Detroit and how the city became what it is after World War II. And we'll get more into that, by Thomas Subaru. So why bother? For the group, I was essentially saying that it's really important to understand the dynamics and things that have made things the way they are in order to be able to address the issues and resolve them. So oftentimes people see an issue or injustice or a void and they want to fill the space or find a resolution, but that resolution is never necessarily going to be concrete or sustainable without knowing what caused it in the first place. Okay, why is Detroit a black city? Rhetorical question. Next slide. Early history. So, one of the things that I've incorporated into my work, I manage a 5-lot property in Northwest Detroit, is just trying to create a different narrative than the narrative that people are taught. And one of the first things that I say is this space that we call Detroit, or Brightmoor, the neighborhood that I live in Detroit, before there were settlers or colonists or white people or black people, there were indigenous people, and the indigenous nation that lived in Michigan and also eastward and westward was the Anishinaabe, but as settler colonists pushed them westward, they kind of settled in Michigan until further pushed west from there. And the primary tribes that made up southeast Michigan were the Odawa, the Potawatomi, and the Ojibwe. And these people still persist and exist there, although they have been marginalized. And I think it's really important to recognize that all of us benefit from their absence and are privileged by essentially taking the land and the space and the resources from them. Although people say it's also really important to identify that they do still exist and are still there, but in a much more marginal, like I think Detroit is 0.2% indigenous people, and even those indigenous people may not have been born and raised in the city. They might have just migrated back. So presumably there's always this romantic narrative that the natives lived in perfect harmony with nature. I don't necessarily believe that's 100% true. It's not necessarily relevant because it's still unjust to come and take the land from them, which is exactly what the French did to some degree and the British to a much greater degree. And I don't think I need to get too deeply into that, but I do know some other stuff if you guys want to discuss that further as well. Once the British decided to stay, which was essentially the main difference between the French and the British established settler colonialism, which evolved into permanence, whereas the French always kind of had a, we'll extract and go back to France. We don't want to be here forever. Once the British decided to stay, there was intentional development of the place as an extension of Britain, or simply an extension of what became a municipality in the United States. And Detroit's earliest history was just logged, so cutting all the trees down for lumber, which probably built other cities like Chicago, was the first kind of industry that came through and cleared the land. And then of course the auto industry is what John mentioned, Motor City is what Detroit is known for. And essentially, in the 20th century, Detroit became like the epicenter of the auto industry. And I remember when I went to Cuba, it was like the first thing I saw when I got off the plane, in addition to Cuban people, were cars that were made in Detroit. And there are many countries and cities in the world where people drive stuff and operate machines that were made in Detroit, which is really incredible. And they know Detroit and recognize it as like Motor City. But the auto industry was this huge complex. Like, there were people in factories that made cars. That's the super obvious clear part. But there were people who brought items and materials to those factories. There are people who designed and invented those materials. There are people who stitched together seats and painted things and made paints and experimented with pigments and did research for the paints and extracted the rubber from foreign countries. And so the Detroit's footprint on the world just in making cars alone was humongous. And the city developed and was this booming golden age renaissance, greatest city on earth, fair paying minimum wage. The main story that we usually get when we hear about it. Oh, is that it? That's my happy ending part. That's exactly what happened. So a part of the auto industry, as Henry Ford's famous $5 a day, am I correct? Not an hour. $5 a day. Attracted people from all over the world, African Americans and black people, particularly from the South, who were escaping sharecropping and racism in the South, came to Detroit, as well as many other industrial cities. Europeans, a lot of Irish, Italian, German, anyone in Europe who got the same message that African Americans in the South did also came across the Atlantic Ocean and from other U.S. cities as well to Detroit for the same opportunities. And a lot of white people from the South, especially like Appalachia, Kentucky, West Virginia, came as well. And unfortunately, there was this perpetuation in the country at large of whiteness, and these are just some of the wonderful signs that most of us are probably familiar with, as racism became a central issue, as Detroit's diversity began to grow. And there was some serious pushback to this influx of non-white and poor people into the city, and a lot of kind of circling of the wagons to protect what was wealth and whiteness in white communities. I had just seen Quentin Tarantino's The Hateful Eight.
Yeah.
There was a scene in there where there's this Mexican guy, and Samuel L. Jackson's character was like, there's no way like you could be the manager of this store, because the former manager had a sign in the store before you got here that said two things: no dogs and no Mexicans. And it was like the owner ended up like liking dogs before they ended up liking Mexicans. And I thought that was just a really interesting line in the movie, to be like provocative, but show how people like were really that adamant about hating and othering other people. So this is just a wonderful picture of three families of three different ethnic groups taken in the 1950s. And during my first presentation, I challenged the audience, as a relatively diverse group of undergrads, to say, imagine being one of these groups, and then what messages you were taught about the other groups through the media at that time. And it's like, as happy as all three families look, the white family might have thought the black family was full of criminals, drug dealers, and rapists. And same thing about the potentially Arab or Latino family in the bottom. And then maybe those families were taught that the white people were like the most dangerous thing to be around if you were in the wrong neighborhood. And, the reality is they're just potentially or hopefully happy parents with happy children. But there's all these other racial dynamics going on at the time. And the other thing that has made Detroit what it is its housing stock, or what was its housing stock. And that wonderful little image in the bottom left corner was like the crux of American society and the pillar of success. The ability to buy yourself a house. And as more people, white or whatever they were, aspire towards home ownership, redlining became a very, is everyone familiar with redlining?
Can you say more about
Cool.
defining it?
Yeah,
And also, could you explain, was there also covenants as well as redlining?
okay, so I can speak more to redlining. I think covenants were just agreements within communities, and you can potentially
Part of the deed restricting how the property can be used.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So redlining was a legal method of essentially keeping people of color from purchasing homes or getting help to purchase homes or any type of financial assistance, loan to buy a home in a certain community. And then they were specifically, so there was a rating system for houses, and if a white family owned a house, then that house would be rated based on its property value, and the property value was determined by essentially the demography or the racial and economic makeup of the neighborhood that the home was in. And if there was one family of color in that neighborhood, then your house's value was tremendously, if not completely, eliminated. So red lines were drawn on maps all across the country around neighborhoods that would not be funded or not get support, and those neighborhoods tended to be black neighborhoods or neighborhoods with people of color at the time. So when redlining first started, and there's an image of Detroit in the 40s and 50s, they actually drew red lines around Jewish neighborhoods and Italian neighborhoods and Irish neighborhoods and black neighborhoods, and there were that like all of those groups were considered threats, which I thought was really surprising because usually in retrospect people say, oh, it's just black people. I only did it to black people or Latinos. And there were also workplace stereotypes. One of the things that I read in the book was, despite the fact that any individual or man particularly could work for an auto plant, there were specific jobs that that person could have or not have based on stereotypes. And women as well. Like a woman could only be a secretary or a clerk or some type of desk person. But that also limited their income, and with the assumption that men, white men, were more intellectual, then they would always have more skill-based jobs. Women would have menial labor, and black people would have like optimal labor and do the most dangerous or the most risky, with the assumption or genuine belief that they were actually more tolerant and durable as physical bodies than other people. And then a culture of vagrancy is something that Urban Crisis also brought up, is due to Detroit's discrimination as well as redlining and restriction of people moving around, a lot of homelessness and a lot of unemployment was rampant through the city, and it really promoted a culture of people who were capable of working but didn't have other options or outlets to do work, of kind of just standing outside in streets or on street corners or in parks. And from a person who is privileged looking at that, you see a person who's not taking advantage of potential opportunities, but these people were really like marginalized, and they would go out and wait on corners for people to pick them up or give them construction jobs as well. And then of course, to resolve that vagrancy problem, heightened police enforcement was put in place, and these people were essentially arrested and jailed for their vagrancy, when what they really wanted was to be engaged and to have more work, which was limited to them. And then another, I guess, point that I wanted to bring up is Detroit, although predominantly black, has a large amount of other ethnic groups present in the city. Hamtramck, which is a city within Detroit, has one of the largest Yemeni and Nepalese populations in the state, as well as the country. And there's also a strong Chaldean and Latino influence in the city as well. And Asians, the Hmong people, brought a lot of actual like agricultural knowledge as well as cultural diversity to the city. Okay, so once the system began to fail, we had outmigration, and usually like the 50s was like really when people thought things started to fall apart in Detroit, and all the trends of disinvestment and outmigration began. And those are in the bottom right corner of that circle is Wayne County and the county that Detroit lives in, and then the others are the counties that people primarily migrated into. What led to Detroit's demise were people leaving by literally tens of thousands of people a year, from the 50s up to now. And the population has begun to kind of bottom out and go back up, particularly in certain parts of the city. Automation, the design and creation of machines, the usage of machines to do people's labor, was a huge factor in eliminating the auto industry's presence and need for labor in the city. And as we mentioned yesterday with the trade agreements and treaties, decentralization and globalization. So decentralization, actually, as a result of World War II, the government really thought it would be beneficial to actually move a lot of concentrated resources, entities, industry, and cities out into more rural or suburban areas in case a city was attacked by the Russians or the Germans or something. It wouldn't be as detrimental of a hit, so there were actually government incentives to encourage companies and corporations to move out. And then racism and capitalism, which are institutions that aren't unique to Detroit, were the other kind of primary factors that really led to the other three issues. Oh, there were pictures for all of the. Well, she didn't. Okay, so the effects of those things are unemployment. Detroit has one of the highest unemployment rates in the country. The neighborhood I live in is about 37%. Continued segregation, disinvestment, and disinvestment particularly harms people's health and access to resources. So the neighborhood I live in is considered one of the most underserved areas due to access to a place to purchase food, response times for police and ambulance or fire trucks, access to a public library, access to public schools, access to public transportation. There's essentially no mechanism in place to provide these things to people due to.
Where is it?
So I live in Northwest Detroit and Brightmoor, which is at about 6 Mile and Grand River.
Yeah.
It's about a 20-minute drive from downtown. And then due to this decreased tax base, degrading infrastructure, in addition to the poor public services, so actually losing the quality of the system that was there in the first place. Pictures for all these things too. So this photo or graphic is important. It just shows the segregation of Southeast Michigan. The red is the highest concentration of black people. I guess that's yellowish, green, orange is the Latino, and then the surrounding area is predominantly white. And essentially Detroit, which supported close to 2 million people at its peak in the 1950s, now has around 700,000.
Oh, wow.
And the reason that the city is predominantly black is really not due to consistent flux of black people into the city. The black population has been pretty stable, but the exponential movement of white people out of the city. So 2 million, if black people were 40%, that 40% is essentially still there. But wealthy black people and middle class black people escaped and left as well. Okay, modern issues in the 21st century of Detroit. The primary things that have really been newsworthy is emergency management. So one random, or not so random, fact about emergency management is of the 14 municipalities in Michigan that had emergency management, all of them had populations, black populations of 50% or more. That includes Benton. I guess Benton Harbor would be the closest place to here. And Kevin Orr was our wonderful or not so wonderful emergency manager, which led to pension cuts, privatization of everything, almost everything, and the rise of authorities. So Detroit now has a housing authority, we now have a water authority, we have a parking authority and a parks authority, and that's just a euphemism, I suppose, for a group of people that determines what to do with whatever name comes before authority. So those groups then have no accountability to the people who they're supposed to serve or expected to serve, and then they can make decisions based on their own interest or the interest of whoever they serve. That has led to water shutoffs, which I'll get more into in my presentation tonight. But one fact is there's over 80,000 people in Detroit right now who do not have access to water in their home because their water's been shut off. Land speculation, so the value of land, the city full of vacant land, is going up really rapidly due to land speculation. Gentrification is occurring, driving up land values, in addition to the speculation, which leads to increased foreclosure and eviction. The education system also has its own emergency manager, who happens to be the same guy, or used to be the same guy, who was Flint's emergency manager. So I'm sure they thought he was competent enough to serve 40 or 50,000 children. And then jobs has essentially always been, at least for the last 60 or 70 years, an issue in Detroit. Never enough sources of revenue or places for people to make money. From a more climate-related perspective, Detroit also has the only oil refinery in Michigan, the Marathon Plant Refinery. Those are just some facts about it. It employs 530 people. It covers about 2 acres of land. It poisons thousands of people. So the zip code 48217, which is in southeast Detroit, is flanked on its northern side by this refinery, and it has one of the highest asthma and cancer rates in the country. And that same zip code also, I didn't include it in the slides, but on its southern border has the water treatment plant, which treats all the water sewage from southeast Michigan, drains into this one place. So on its north is this oil refinery, which specializes in Canadian crude, refining Canadian crude oil, which is essentially the dirtiest oil we can find. And then on its southern border is everybody's poop that essentially flows down from like all over the suburbs. No surprise that they would have the highest cancer and asthma. You gotta laugh to keep from crying. Detroit also has the second largest incinerator in the country, the only incinerator in the state of Michigan. And to add insult to injury, the incinerator facility is called the Detroit Renewable Power Plant. And that's because they actually take predominantly waste from the suburbs and they burn it in a slow way that turns it into a refuse-derived fuel. And then they take that fuel and they burn it to heat water for steam that either powers a generator for electricity or goes through the city to heat some of the buildings downtown. And the incinerator, very similar to the refinery, is close to schools, it's close to neighborhoods. I bike by there every time I go to the east side, and it smells awful, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Both the Marathon Refinery and the incinerator have the lowest regulation for like emissions of toxins and CO2. They're essentially unregulated by the state and the EPA. So in addition to already like insult to injury, they violate the standards that were set for them not to violate anyway. All right, in Detroit. And one of the reasons they're in Detroit is because Detroit was so desperate for industry and income and jobs. All 530 people who aren't even probably from Detroit, who work at the refinery, the mayor or the city council were really, they didn't have any bargaining ground or leverage, so they were essentially taking whatever they could get and allowing these plants to establish and develop in Detroit. Okay,
Sorry.
this is the last slide, I think. Well, there's one more slide, which makes me feel bad. These are some of the organizations I work with and some of the main groups doing social justice and environmental justice work in the city. People's Water Board is primarily focused on addressing the water shutoff problem. They currently have it's called a bill package, 5 bills proposed for the state legislature, and I have information for people to call their local congressman or whoever to help that bill get passed. If I can remember correctly, the bill is to establish standards for water, so you can't shut off someone's water if they have children, if they're handicapped, if they're a senior. One is to establish water as a human right, which is kind of far-fetched, but the international community believes it, so I can't mention again. The other is to create an affordability plan for people who are supposed to have their water shut off, and that affordability plan would essentially be 2% of whatever their income is would be paid for their water bill. And I'm not sure what the other 2 points are, but that bill has been kind of floating around in a committee for most of this year, and it should be on a ballot or something potentially this fall. We the People of Detroit is primarily focused on foreclosure and water justice as well. They're trying to get a water affordability plan passed at the city level through city council, and also get a moratorium on home foreclosure and eviction. Moratorium now is specifically focused on evictions, so people who don't own homes should not be forced out of a home for a negligent landlord. Detroit is resisting emergency management. Still exists, I guess, though they still have the emergency manager of the school, but it was founded in 2013 just to kind of check, serve as a watchdog, and also kind of regulate or put pressure on the emergency manager when he was over the city. Michigan Welfare Rights is really a group that unfortunately has inherited a lot of social services from the city, as the state and the city have divested from providing them. So they do housing rights, children's rights, providing food and water, and they're just completely like work to the bone. It's a nonprofit mostly made of social workers and healthcare providers. The People's Platform, in addition to all of them, is focused on these last 2 things, which are kind of the primary constructive efforts that activists and community organizers are working on in the city. So I focus mostly on like, please put a moratorium on water shutoffs and foreclosure or eviction. But in addition to that, community land trust and community benefits agreements are things that we should be moving forward with on a policy level. The community land trust is essentially taking land in the city and putting it in a trust, and then allowing a governing body to have autonomy over how that land is stewarded. The city currently has, I think, 80,000 vacant properties in the land bank, and that doesn't include properties that are still at the municipal or the county level, which is about 1/3 of the city is essentially like, what should we do with this land? And there's like all kinds of people who don't have political power necessarily or political position saying, I know exactly what to do with it. Let me make my own school, please. Let me grow food, please. Let me create affordable housing for people, please. And like, I can't hear you. John Hintz, what can you do? Mike Illich, what can you do? Dan Gilbert, what can you do? And land trust is like, it gives autonomy over the people. Usually a land trust has 3 individuals who live or reside in the neighborhood or the trust, 3 people who live around it, and then 3 like board members or people who can inform or have some type of insight on what can be done with the land and have access to how to improve it. And then that also takes power out of the city or a governing body from controlling what happens to that land and just trust it in the possession of that governing body. One last thing and then we can get to the question. And the community benefits agreements For any future development forecasted, projected, or planned for the city, any private development should require a community benefits agreement, which is in the development plan. There's a legal binding contract that says the entity developing whatever will be developed will provide some type of benefit to the neighborhood. Ideally, they would get a profit or some type of income base from. So the hockey stadium is one of the failed efforts to get a community benefits agreement. People were like, "Oh, this would be a great opportunity since taxpayer dollars are building the hockey stadium. It's actually being subsidized by Detroit residents. It's not being paid for by the Illich family. Ideally, the stadium will be built. Some portion of ticket sales and all the revenue that the stadium generates would be returned into the community through school programs or something like that. People would be employed. People who live in the surrounding neighborhood would be employed. That would be a part of the agreement. And it would just establish a much more accountable working relationship. So we're trying to get a community benefits proposal passed in the city as well. As of July, there was a community benefits proposal on the ballot for this fall.
Humor.
That's great.
As of July, there was a grassroots proposal. I think it was about 6,000 signatures on a petition to get a community benefits agreement passed by city council, mandating that all future development require some type of dialogue, sitting down with community members. And in July, at the end of the month, a guy named Pat Benson, who's on city council, who is considered like one of the mayor's pawns, passed an identical proposal with the same name, missing like all the same proponents. So coming this November, we'll be fighting really hard to get the common lay person who votes to recognize that one says community benefits agreement A and the other says community benefits agreement B. That's the only thing. That's the only thing.
They're both on the ballot?
Yeah.
Oh, jeez.
So we're gonna try to just tell people to vote A. Yeah. They won the debate essentially with the council president to get the name change, because anybody who goes to the polling place can simply read both documents there, which are relatively long and convoluted with all kinds of legal language. But yes, there's no need to distinguish between them legally. So, I did a presentation with a cute baby, as it said, and that's the cutest baby I think I've ever seen. So, real little person. Okay.
Have you tried it?
Adorable baby.
I don't. I googled cute baby. Yeah. Yeah, I want that one. One day. Okay, any questions?
Well, one real quick
Oh,
question, that thing you just talked about, the
Community
item
benefits.
A or item B,
Mm-hmm.
what happens if both pass?
It's a good question. I'm not sure.
If you can only vote for one, you can't vote both times.
Right, but it could be a 50-50 split potentially.
Oh, you can only vote yes on one of them?
No, you
So,
probably vote
yeah.
yes on both, no?
Yeah, you could.
Wow. It's gotta be one or the other, otherwise
No.
it doesn't make any sense.
No.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
It's gotta be up or down on
Provisions.
Sorry. I didn't-
Supposedly they're different, so
You might wanna be able to vote.
So we
you
have
know,
a
on both.
wonderful talking piece, and we just pass it around and around and around. Starting with Mia.
Okay. Is there, are any of these in the last organizing list, that were involved or helped created by Grace Lee Boggs?
I don't think so. But I do know people affiliated with the Bog Center are definitely involved in all of them to some degree. if anything, I would imagine Detroiters resisting emergency management would be the most closely affiliated with like the Bog Center. But they're all, to my knowledge, like established in the 21st century. So
Did you ever meet her?
I actually lived on the same block my first year, and as Grace, and I never got to meet her because the one chance I had to play at her birthday, my grandmother was having her own birthday.
Oh.
And I had to decide with my family. But I did help.
Her 100th birthday, her 100th or 101st?
It would have been Grace's 99th.
Oh, 99.
Mm-hmm.
You might explain who Boggs is.
Yes, so Grace Lee Boggs is a renowned active. I guess she's not that renowned.
Well, yeah.
In certain circles,
Amongst
yes. Renowned activist in Detroit. She moved to Detroit in the 40s, if I'm not mistaken, and played a really pivotal role in a lot of activism and grassroots organizing, as well as just philosophical and evolutionary thought on what it means to organize, what it means to envision a new community and challenge systems at play. There's a really awesome, she's well published as well. I think she has over 12 books. And there's a documentary on her called Grace Lee Boggs, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
I actually asked my question already.
You'll get another chance if other things emerge.
I think I have a question.
Franco Gonzalo.
Thank you for sharing all that. So I wanted to ask you about the organizing work that you're doing and what kinds of cooperation exists right now, because we think about Detroit and Flint and what's happening in some of the news that we hear about Michigan. How are people collaborating across all these different issues, and do you see the emergence of something bigger than just little groups trying to fight for their little, like the smaller everyday issues? Do you see more happening on the collaborative front in order to push back the bigger structural things that?
Yeah, so there's definitely a fair amount of overlap simply between the individuals in these organizations and what they participate in, but also the organizations working together. And I was talking to Howard at breakfast earlier about it. I think one of the hugest obstacles that more or less keeps these organizations as well as others siloed is just the constant need to serve people with this tremendous urgency just to survive. So People's Water Board in particular, as well as We the People, and People's Platform, there are low staff. People's Water Board actually is a coalition. So We the People and People's Platform, they spend and expend so much energy just meeting people's daily needs that they haven't had the opportunity to create the space that they need to even take a step back and just figure out how to form larger groups and build movement. Because every day there's hundreds of phone calls of I'm getting kicked out of my house right now. My water got shut off. I need a lawyer. I need a social worker. And due to the, I guess, just low human capital that they have, it's been really difficult to move forward. I do feel that the organizations are growing, but there's also this constant tension of like despair and like hopefulness. So young people will get involved, and we have this instant gratification kind of orientation to life, and when years pass, you're like, this will never work anyway. Like, I can't take it. And then older people, in a lot of ways, are kind of ingrained in what are considered like archaic organizing models, and it's hard to attract new people when your tactics don't seem effective. So, me personally, whenever someone organizes a protest, I'm like, I don't want to go walk in the street for hours. I don't want to make noise outside of a building, because I've never felt that be a constructive mechanism. Like, they're up there on the 13th floor typing, doing emails, and we're down here yelling for hours. Like, it's cool for camaraderie, but if it's cold out or it's rainy, like, it's not cool for morale. One of the things that the more radical or maybe courageous of us are trying to do is actually coordinate more civil disobedience and resistance, and those measurably have shown tremendous effectiveness. Last year in particular, they actually put a 2-week moratorium on water shutoffs after people put pressure on the county treasurer to stop authorizing them. And there's also a group called the Omric 9, which are 9 individuals who stood in front of, Omric is the name of actually a demolition company that was contracted by the mayor's office to facilitate the shutoffs, so they're not even trained in shutting off water. They essentially just bust up your pipes or as best they can to seal them. They stood in front of where they dispersed the truck dispatch, and blocked trucks for about a half a day and prevented 2,000 shutoffs for a day. But we need more people to be willing to be arrested, and more people who are willing to take risks and chances, because when we sit in closed doors and privileged spaces and just talk, the madness continues, and the opposition also continues. For example, after Omric, after they blocked the dispatch, within a month, their truck parking lot was absolved, and now the trucks operate from remote sites, and we have no idea where to find them anymore. And they also changed the times of day. So last year, you would get your water shut off anytime during working hours, like 9 to 5, and there would be an opportunity for someone to run through the neighborhood screaming, or call 911, or call your best friend. And now they do it between usually 3 a.m. and 5 a.m. So it's usually while people are sleeping, and you can't follow a truck. We used to follow trucks back to find out where they were parking. And it's, unless you're willing, which we might have to get to that point, to surveil streets, which is a tremendous expenditure of our energy as well. We have to think of more radical and novel ways of disturbance and disruption than the old-fashioned, like, please do this thing now, thank you, and then go home and sleep. And it's also really difficult to involve the people who are affected the most, because their concerns and their needs are so great. Like, if you're a parent, single parent or not, and you have multiple children, and their school's shut down, and their water's shut off, or they've been evicted, the last thing they want to do is come to a meeting or have a conversation.
Even if they want to, it's hard to.
Right. So thank you for saying that. People really do want to be more involved, and they're like, if I do this, someone's gonna go hungry tonight, or I'll miss a bill, or I can't go to work. So there's just a tremendous amount of tension and difficulty in organizing.